Hello, and welcome to Reading Genesis with Gender in Mind. This is an online version of a public lecture that I gave the other day at Central Methodist University. It was sponsored by Alliance at Central Methodist University, a group that supports LGBTQ plus members of the campus community, and they had asked me to give the lecture on the occasion of Transgender Visibility Week. I'm teaching a class on religion, sex, and gender, and so I thought that it would work out well to basically adapt some of the things that I had talked about in class to the public lecture. It's really about sex and gender, but I thought about titling it really Reading Genesis with sex in mind, but it occurred to me that addressing that to college students might come across with the wrong connotations. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some basic texts from Genesis, texts that are often taken and read to indicate a simple binary view of the world where there are males and females that have been created that way by God and no intermediary positions. Also read to endorse what is often viewed as the biblical view of marriage, that marriage should be between one male and one female. Those ideas, I'm not going to say they aren't possible readings of the texts. They are possible readings of the text, but I'm going to point out that they're not the only readings of the text, and that reading texts of the Bible is complicated and always involves interpretation by the person who is doing the reading. So that forms a good place to start. When we read any text or take any statement, we always need a context and an author in order to make sense of the text. To put this slightly a different way, words don't mean things, people mean things with words. I think we get confused about this, and oftentimes people get confused about it with the Bible, thinking that the Bible just means something. It is a text that immediately has meaning, independent of the work that is done interpreting it, independent of particular history or context or anything like that. In part, I blame dictionaries for confusing us about this. I think dictionaries get us confused about a lot of things because oftentimes people think that dictionaries give you what words should mean, rather than that they are a reflection of what usages of words have done in the past. They also lead us to think that words have meaning all on their own, independent of particular context, but they don't. To give an example of this, to make this point, we can just take an imaginary situation. Imagine that you're walking along and you come across a piece of paper and you pick it up, and the piece of paper says, "This vacuum sucks." Now, does that paper have any meaning? I mean, it's got words on it, but do the words have any meaning? And I would suggest that they don't really, because they could just mean lots of different things, right? What is the vacuum? It might be something that you clean your house with. It also might be the vacuum of space. It might be a picture of a vacuum that it's talking about. We just don't know, independent of any concept of the context in which it was written and who it's written by. So unless we know where, when, and in what context it's written, the sentence really doesn't have any meaning. Take also sucks, right? So it might be claiming that something sucks. It is drawing things into a particular space. Or it might mean, well, it's really bad. It is malfunctioning. So this vacuum that I have at home isn't working to pull things up into it. Or it might mean, if we're talking about the picture of the vacuum, like maybe it was made by a kindergartner who doesn't really know what a vacuum looks like, and so they did a really bad job, and so you'd be, oh, that That vacuum sucks. The sentence just has no meaning on its own if we don't assume particular things about the context in which the sentence is put forward and about the author. Now, this means that what we do whenever we read anything, really, is we make assumptions about the context and the author. We project our assumptions. We imagine a particular author in a particular context in order to get the words to have meaning for us. We do this so automatically most of the time that we don't even think about it. But especially when we get to texts that are extremely old and from cultures that are not our own, it turns out there's a lot of work that needs to be done in projecting an author, imagining an author, and imagining a context. And when you get to texts like Genesis, this is incredibly hard. That's because these texts have lots and lots of different potential authors that we could look at and try and find the meaning for their own context, given their own intentions. So, for instance, Genesis 1 and 2, are extremely old stories. They might have come in oral forms before they ever got written down. And in those oral forms, they were probably told over and over and over again. Now, which one of the people that told that story gives it its meaning, right? Was it the first person who told the story, or was it the second, or the third, or the fourth? Because it turns out that when we tell stories, even if we tell exactly the same story, if we tell it in a different context, it often has a different meaning. We see this in our own culture. We retell the story of, say, The Little Mermaid with slight differences to it, and its meaning changes, right? So if we go back to Hans Christian Andersen's version, right, it's a story about how it's dangerous to pursue human guys. That's not a good thing. The Little Mermaid actually dies in the end. Then there's another retelling of it, which is the cartoon version that tells it, and it's actually a kind of romantic tale, a nice children's story. Obviously, the Little Mermaid doesn't die in the end. And then there was a kind of live version retelling, another Disney movie, which ended up being about racial relations somehow. We tell the story again and again with slight deviations in different contexts, and the story comes to mean something different. Well, these stories go back to a time where we don't even know what exact slight deviations they were making in the stories, and we have to kind of reconstruct that if we want to get back to the original oral tellings of the story. But maybe that's not where we want to go. Maybe we want to go with the first time that these stories got written down. Okay, well, where was that and when was that? Here's another question that we don't have great answers to. What parts of the story were written down, and how were they then combined with other parts later on, right? So it turns out most scholars today don't believe that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 were written down at the same time. They were written down as separate stories, and then they were incorporated together by a later editor, right? So maybe we don't want to know who wrote it down and what they meant by it, but we want to know what the editor meant when they put the stories together, right? So that gives us a whole different meaning potentially for the text. And then, of course, even once they were written down, people didn't stop retelling these stories. And so the stories took on new meaning as they continued to be retold. So if you talk to people today, often they will think that the serpent in Genesis 3 is Satan, or they will think that the fruit that they pulled down from the tree, Adam and Eve, was an apple. But it turns out that neither one of those things is said in the original telling of the story, and probably the people who originally told the story, wrote it down, or put it together as editors didn't have that in mind. Does that mean that those later retellings are not potential meanings that the story takes on? Well, they have been significant meanings that have been retold and become central meanings of the text for people much later on. So then there are whole communities for which these texts take on meaning. I highlight all of this just to say the problem of reading a text isn't just getting back to what the author meant by it, but figuring out which author do we mean and at which time. Texts end up having multiple different possible meanings depending on who the author is, what the intention is, and what the context is. And every time that we sit down to read a text, we have to figure out exactly what it is we're looking for, who the author is, what the context is, and we have to imagine that and then go back and read the text. And ironically, almost every time, this makes us a new author of the story because the meaning that we draw out of it is inevitably at least a little different from those that any of the original authors or interpreters of the text have put forward across time. So we're participants in a long tradition of reading and rereading these stories. Now, I don't think that makes all readings of the text equally good. I mean, we can have takes that are better or worse at going back and approximating what original authors or editors or tellers of the story meant by the story. But we do need to recognize that we're always participants in this ongoing tradition of interpretation. And so we should be careful about claiming that the meaning that we find in the text is the only meaning. And that will be illustrated as we look at particular texts from Genesis. I want to start out by pointing out some of the conclusions that scholars have reached in recent scholarship that might clash with the presuppositions that some historical readers might have brought to the text. There are traditional claims that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Pentateuch itself doesn't make that claim, but there is a long tradition of claiming that Moses was the author, even though the Pentateuch tells the story of Moses' death, which is difficult to write down if you're the one writing about it. Most contemporary scholars don't believe that that is the case, and we don't believe that in part because as you go back and look through the text, it doesn't look like there is any one author. Contemporary scholars tend to reject the claim of univocality. That is the claim that there was any one author originally for the different texts that are put together in the Pentateuch or often in other books of the Bible. These books are compilations of different stories that have gone together. And we can see this if we look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, which most scholars today take to be 2 different stories of creation. So, for instance, in Genesis 1, there are 6 days of creation. In Genesis 2, it's implied that everything happens on one day. The context in which you start is different between the 2 of them. So in one, there's watery chaos. In the other, it seems like it's an oasis that is kind of separate from everything else. There are no plants yet. The sequence of creation is quite different in the 2, and you can see that in the sketch behind me. The method of creation, the portraits of God, the names of God that are used, and the pictures of humanity that are put forward are different in the 2 texts. Now, This leads us to one of the first questions that we have to resolve in trying to find meaning in the text. Should we read these two as written by one author, univocal, or should we read them as two separate narratives, right? We will recognize that lots of people historically have read them as one coherent narrative. But to do that, you have to do a lot of interpretive work to say, oh, I guess the second story is really just a kind of zoom in on this one day in creation. And when it says, like, God created this, well, he'd already created that. So maybe it means he created that for the first time in this place. Rather than doing all of that interpretive work, as I say, most scholars today just accept that these are two different stories of creation. I'm going to assume that, although as we'll see as we go through some of the traditional interpretations, not everybody has assumed that, and there have been various different assumptions throughout the history of Christian and Jewish interpretation. That said, let's look at Genesis 1:26 through 28. Then God said, "Let us make humankind," Adam. That word's going to be a problem from the very beginning, because the word Adam can mean humankind, it can mean man, it can also be a proper name for a guy named Adam in our terms. Here, it almost certainly means humankind, and the English translation reflects that, although there will be different people who will read it differently. Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." All right, so now we want to interrogate this text and try and figure out what is the meaning of the text and what meanings might we be bringing to the text. That raises some initial questions. So, for instance, how many people are created in this text? Now, you might automatically think, well, there's two people that are created in the text. But did the text say that, or do we bring that to the text? It says, so God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. But the text doesn't give any particular number of people that are created at this point. So why do people often assume that God creates two people in this text? Well, it's because they're reading Genesis 2, where God creates Adam and Eve, two people, and they go back and they read it into this text, but it doesn't actually say that. Here it just says God created some unspecified number of people. So in this text, it seems like God might have created a number of different people. A second question, who's created in the image of God? Are both males and females created in the image of God, or are only males created in the image of God? Well, if you read the text, it seems to suggest that in the image of God, God created them, male and female, he created them. Males and females are both created in the image of God. But if you read Genesis 2 and kind of smash it together with Genesis 1, we can get different interpretations. Take, for instance, Paul's claim. In 1 Corinthians, Paul, who's writing several hundred years later, interpreting Genesis, says, "For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God. But woman is the reflection of man. Indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man." Now, what's Paul doing here? Well, he's taking that passage from Genesis 1 And he's smashing it together with Genesis 2, where it suggests that Adam was created first and second, Eve out of Adam. And on the basis of kind of mixing and matching the meanings of these two texts, he's concluding that actually men were created in the image of God and women seem to fall outside of that image. Now, this is a really bad reading of Genesis. And even Paul seems to realize as he's writing 1 Corinthians 11 that he's gotten himself into trouble. He actually tries to back himself out before he gets out of the chapter. So here he said that woman was created from man, but later he goes on to say, oh, yeah, but every man also comes from a woman. And so he tries to make the text more equal in its treatment of men and women later on. He's gotten caught up in this issue of who should veil their heads during worship. He thinks that women should veil their heads during worship, whereas men shouldn't. And he's kind of going back and reading the text in order to get that conclusion. But the reasoning that he has to draw out of the text to get that conclusion, he even realizes later on, he probably has gone too far in trying to read that out. So here's an instance in which we get two meanings to the text, depending on which author we pay attention to. Are we taking Paul's retelling of the story to be the meaning of the text? Are we going back to the original person who, say, wrote this down in Genesis? If we go with the original, it seems that males and females are created in the image of God. If we go with Paul at this fairly poorly argued point, it seems that men are created in the image of God. Another question with this text is, what are the limits that God has placed on creation? So when it says male and female, God created them, is this just saying that God has created male and female, and God has created no other options? Like, what happens to intersex people who are born with ambiguous genitalia or something in between male and female? Are those monstrosities, something God didn't create? Did God make a mistake when those people were born? Well, there is one way of reading the text that would suggest this. It is true that in the book of Genesis, God is interested in bringing order out of chaos. And oftentimes the Hebrew scriptures represent God as deeply concerned with maintaining different kinds of things separate from each other. So for instance, in Deuteronomy 22:9, it says, "You shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed, or the whole yield will have to be forfeit, both the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard itself." Here, the text is worried about mixing different kinds of seed with each other because we need to keep them separated out from each other. Similarly, there's another passage that suggests we shouldn't mix different fabrics with each other because God is worried about maintaining different kinds separate from each other. And so if we read this passage in the light of these kinds of commandments, we can get the conclusion that what God is doing here is separating out two absolute different kinds, male and female, and there's really nothing in between. Thus, whatever is in between must be an aberration of those kinds that God created. But that's not the only way to read the text. There is another possibility. If we go back to the beginning of Genesis, we find that this passage is covered with a particular literary convention that's called a merism. Now, a merism is any time that you take two extremes and you have them represent the entirety of a particular class of things. So, for instance, God creates the heavens and the earth. But does that mean God creates nothing that is in between the heavens and the earth? God separates light from darkness, but does this mean that there are no variations in more or less light? God separates night from day, but does that mean there's no evening? Earth and sea, but does that mean there is no beach? God creates animals of the water and the air and the land, but does that mean that there's only animals of land and water? There are no amphibians? Are frogs kind of aberrations that don't have a place in God's creation? Well, no. These are literary conventions where we're only mentioning two sides of a whole set or a particular set of striking instances of a set. But that doesn't mean that those instances exhaust the set. This is kind of like saying God created Alpha and Omega. In saying that, we're not saying that God only created the beginning and the end and nothing in between. But in saying it, we're saying God created the beginning and the end and everything in between. Now, if you read this text, male and female, God created them, in the light of this use of merism, then it might be that what it's saying is God creates male and female and everything in between those two options. So what you're left with is not a binary creation, male and female, but a potential continuum of creation, male and female and all the other options in between. On the basis of the text, both of these are potential readings that in some way go back to traditions that we can see in the Hebrew scriptures and represented in the earliest texts. So, as I say, I'm not going to argue that one of them is absolutely the proper reading, but either one of them are genuine possible readings of the text. What about the claim that human beings should be fruitful and multiply? Oftentimes, people who wish to see a binary in this story read into that the claim that, okay, here we're clearly dealing with two kinds of people that can copulate with each other, that can reproduce, and so that must be what God is getting at. To read the text in this way is to read be fruitful and multiply as a kind of command, which is normative for every person. But it turns out that that's not the traditional way that this text has been read, certainly not in Judaism. If we look at the Talmud, for instance, we find that in Judaism there is a mitzvah, a command to procreate, that is read out of the Hebrew scriptures. But this isn't the text that they go to find that. So in the Talmud, in Sanhedrin 59b, it says, "Isn't there a mitzvah of procreation, which was stated with regard to the descendants of Noah?" So the question is there an obligation to procreate for all of humanity and not just for the Jewish people? And then they say, "It is written, and you be fruitful and multiply, swarm the land and multiply it." That's found in Genesis 9:7. So it's notable here that they don't go back to Genesis 1. They claim that there was a command to the descendants of Noah to procreate. And the question is whether this was actually a commandment to all of them that is binding on all of the Gentiles, all of the non-Jews. This was repeated at Sinai, where it says, "Go say to them, return to your tents." Nevertheless, it says, the mitzvah of procreation was stated for the Jewish people and not for the descendants of Noah. So according to a traditional Jewish reading, not only does Genesis 1 not give a commandment to all people that they should procreate, but even after the flood with Noah, even when it says there, you should be fruitful and multiply, it's not giving an explicit command from God that everyone needs to procreate. And what do they make then of texts like Genesis 1 when it says, "Go forth and multiply"? Well, in another section from the Talmud, we can find this. "A widow is married on Thursday and engages in intercourse on Friday, since the blessing of procreation was stated to man on the sixth day of creation." In this traditional Jewish reading of the text, what happens in Genesis 1 is not a command to procreate, but is a blessing of procreation. God is saying procreation is good, but God's not saying everyone has to procreate. And we could look at reasons why this might be problematic for people who say can't procreate, who don't have the ability to. In the Hebrew scriptures, there was often a great focus on having children, and a great scourge to a woman is when she finds herself unable to bear children. Now, Judaism has to deal with that on their own terms, but there seem to be very good reasons for Christians to come across and say, I'm not sure that that actually is a good thing to read as a commandment. Even more so because of the New Testament's approach to procreation. In Matthew 19, Jesus is discussing the problem of divorce, and he says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery. And Jesus' disciples come to him and they say, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. Then Jesus says to them, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Now, what's happening here is Jesus says, okay, it's better never to get divorced. His disciples say, that's true. Isn't it better never to get married? And Jesus says, yeah, as a matter of fact, some people have become eunuchs from birth. Now, that's a fascinating claim all unto itself, because it seems to suggest that there are people who are born without either male or female genitalia. To be a eunuch is traditionally to have one's male genitalia removed. But if you are a eunuch from birth, you appear to have been born without either male or female genitalia. And Jesus seems to be putting this forward as an accepted fact. Yeah, God doesn't just create males or females. Some are born as eunuchs from birth. And then there are some who are made eunuchs by other people. This would be a common practice in the Roman Empire. The Romans usually didn't create eunuchs. They didn't make eunuchs by removing the genitalia, but other empires did, and people sometimes came into the Roman Empire as eunuchs and took a place in Roman society as a kind of unique sex and gender, as a eunuch, which is quite different from being a male or a female in Roman society. Then Jesus says, there are some who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Now, is Jesus literally saying here that there are people that should cut off their genitalia in order to avoid feeling like they need to get married? Most scholars don't think so. Most scholars think that this is a metaphorical usage of the term eunuch. What Jesus is saying is that people should control their sexual desires and not get married. Although it is notable that even in the early church, there were some people who appear to have taken this literally. At least there are some stories of early Christian fathers, like a guy named Origen, who was an early Christian teacher, who did in fact make himself a eunuch. And later on in Christian tradition, the position of the eunuch becomes one that is much more respectable than it was in Roman society, where it was taken to be a kind of malformation. For Christians, they can take it almost to be a representation of something that is holy, because it separates a person from the concerns of the world, from baser desires. And so in, say, Byzantine Christianity, there could be images of the holy man who was a eunuch. They later interpreted Daniel, the prophet, to have been a court eunuch of Nebuchadnezzar, and yet to have been a very holy man. So this text has a fascinating history inside of Christianity, but it's problematic if we read that text from Genesis 1 to imply that everyone should in fact get together and procreate, because Jesus is clearly telling us No, that's not the way it works, at least under his interpretation of the way that people are supposed to be in anticipation of the kingdom of heaven. This was no doubt a bit of a problematic reading for early Christians, and it undermines a lot of gendered assumptions in Roman and Jewish society. But Jesus doesn't back off from giving it. Okay, let's go on from there to look at some passages from Genesis 2 that are often taken to imply binarity and particular relations between genders. Then the Lord God formed man, and here Adam, again, the word, whether it means human being or whether it means man, is up for some discussion here. The Lord God formed Adam from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man, Adam, became a living thing. Then the Lord said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper for his partner." Here it's notable that helper is not a degrading status. It is not a secondary status. There are points in the Bible where God is said to be a helper of Israel. So there's nothing that says that the helper here is anything less than the original being that's created. So out of the ground, the Lord formed every animal. But for the man, there was not found a helper as his partner. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, or his sides, and then closed up the place with flesh. And the rib, or side, that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and brought her to the man. And the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." Now, what does this text say, and what are we bringing to it? Well, first we might ask, what sex or gender was Adam when he was first created? I think most people who read this text today assume that when Adam was first created, he was created as a man, and that's the way the text is translated. But the text doesn't actually say this. It says he created on Adam, a human, right? So it's entirely possible that, say, Adam was either both sexes or no sex or a male. Any of these are possible, and we can find these kinds of readings in the tradition. So, for instance, in the Talmud, Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Eliezer also said Adam was first created with two faces, one male and the other female. As is stated, "You have formed me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me." So here's a traditional reading of the Genesis text, which suggests that Adam was first made both male and female. And then when God came along and pulled from Adam's side, Adam's rib, what he did is he pulled the female part apart from the male part. And then he had a woman, and for the first time, he had a true male. This actually goes along with the suggested creation pictured by Plato in the Symposium. He suggests at one point the sexes were not two as they are now, but originally many in number. There was a man and a woman and a neuter, and too many others to count. The people were of two or more bodies, joined, as I will describe. There was man, and woman, and man, and man-neuter, and as many other combinations as might be imagined. This is eventually drawn out by Plato into the idea that what everyone is trying to do in the world is find their way back to their soulmate, the person that they were pulled apart from in creation. And so if you were, say, a man-man and pulled apart as man-man in creation, you might want to find yourself a way back to a man, even if you're a man. And if you were a woman-woman, you would want to find your way back to a woman. The Talmud at this point is at least tipping its hat to this kind of story of creation and reading it as the meaning of the text of Genesis. Now, that's one traditional reading, one way to read it. And there's nothing in the text that tells us explicitly that that's not what the case was. It just doesn't really tell us about the sex or gender of Adam before male and female were separated out from each other. What about the claim that therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh? Many contemporary interpreters take this to be the definition of the biblical marriage, which is actually a really strange thing. Because if we look back at the Hebrew Scriptures tradition, no one was taking one man and one woman to be the normative definition of marriage. I mean, there are kings like Solomon who have 500 concubines and 500 wives. I don't know how he found the time. There are patriarchs who have servants and wives and many children by both. There are lots of patriarchs who practice polygamy. So no one in those ancient texts is taking this passage to be normative of exactly what a marriage looks like. But this is a passage that's, say, repeated by Jesus, and so it gains particular traction in Christianity, especially for those who want to find here a definition of marriage. In Matthew 19, it says that some Pharisees came to him, and to test him they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" Again, the question of divorce. Jesus answered, "Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning said, he made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his mother and his father and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Now, it'll be noted here that Jesus, or Matthew's Jesus in this case, has taken part from Genesis 1 and part from Genesis 2. He's taken the part that says, he made them male and female, and he's taken from Genesis 2, where it says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Does this mean that Jesus and Genesis are really endorsing that marriage is only an institution between one man and one woman? Is the emphasis here that there is a binary between men and women, and that what's happening is that they should be put together and them only? Well, let's look back at the context. This text says, for this reason, man shall leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife. And we might wonder what that reason is in the text. So if we go back to Genesis 2, we'll realize that the Lord first said, it's not good that man should be alone. It's not good that Adam should be alone. So God is concerned with the individuality of Adam. The separateness of Adam is the problem that God is trying to address in this passage. And God first goes about this by creating all of the different animals. And you can kind of imagine God, there's Adam sitting there, and God creates a cow, and he says, oh, well, should you guys be together? Will you be best friends? And that doesn't seem like it works. And he creates like a cat, and he puts them together, and he's like, no, the cat is obviously better than you. And then he creates a dog, and for some reason he doesn't think that the dog and Adam actually work together. He tries all of these different things to put together with Adam, and none of them work. And then he creates out of man woman. And it's at this point that Adam says, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." What makes the two appropriate for each other is not that they are opposites of each other, but that they are the same as each other. That they are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. That they are the same flesh, and that they are the same bone that actually puts them together. That they are both human beings. And this is the point at which it says, "Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." It's because they are from one human flesh that they come back together into one human flesh. And the problem here is not that people are getting together that are not male and female. The problem is individuality and the ways that we separate ourselves from other people and don't find ourselves our way back to social relationships with each other. And so putting people together in marriage is a way of binding us together in sociality. The goal here is not said to be procreation at any point. The goal is sociality. So if this is the biblical definition of marriage, the goal of marriage is not procreation, and it doesn't seem like there's anything then that necessarily restricts it to male or female. Because if we take the text on its own grounds and as concerning its own interests, it's actually concerned with the commonality between the two and their common humanity. Now, all of this, as I've said, is not to suggest this is the only way to read these texts, but it is to remind us that the text doesn't read itself. Words don't have meanings. Humans have meanings for words. Humans make meanings with what they do with words. We can be more or less responsible as we go back to the text and try and address it as maybe those earliest authors in their own context might have intended the text to mean. But at the end of the day, there's no way to remove our own participation in that act of interpretation. So the next time that somebody comes to you and says, well, the Bible says, take a moment and say, that might be what you read the Bible to say, but maybe we should go back and be a little bit more careful and try and find out what are some different perspectives that pick up on this text and that might give us a different view of God and the world and what God might be doing with the text and what God means by it. Thank you very much. This has been Reading Genesis with Gender in Mind.